Some substances don't announce themselves. No smell, no burn, no warning, just contact, and then consequences you won't understand until it's too late. This is a countdown of 10 substances you should never, under any circumstances, touch. And we're starting somewhere that looks almost ordinary. Number 10, white phosphorus. It doesn't wait for a spark. The moment white phosphorus meets open air, it ignites. Not from heat, not from friction, just oxygen. That's the mechanism, and it's the reason this substance sits in a category almost nothing else occupies. A material that has decided combustion is its resting state. The burn temperature sits at around 800 degrees Celsius, roughly the same as the interior of a pottery kiln, the kind used to fire ceramic tiles. But a kiln is controlled. White phosphorus is not. Pour water on it and you suppress it briefly. Remove the water and it comes back. The only way to stop it is to eliminate all oxygen contact, which, in a field setting or on human skin, is essentially impossible. White phosphorus has been used in military munitions for over a century. Smoke screens, incendiary rounds, illumination shells. It disperses on impact into burning fragments that scatter across a wide area, and those fragments embed. That's the detail that makes this different from almost any other burn agent. The substance doesn't stay on the surface. It buries into tissue and keeps burning from the inside because even beneath the skin, there's enough biological material, fat, fluid, the body's own chemistry, to sustain the reaction. Surgeons dealing with white phosphorus wounds have to work in the dark, literally. The fragments glow faintly green in low light, a phenomenon called chemiluminescence, and that glow is the only reliable way to locate every piece before closing a wound. Miss one and it continues, not metaphorically. Physically continues, burning inward for as long as oxygen finds a path. There are documented cases of wounds that remained active for days after initial treatment. Fragments too small to locate, too deep to extract cleanly, still oxidizing in tissue. The body cannot neutralize it. The immune system has no mechanism for a substance that is, functionally, on fire. White phosphorus is still present in stockpiles worldwide and has been documented in conflict zones as recently as the last decade. Its use against civilian populations is prohibited under international humanitarian law, though the definition of prohibited use has been contested in several conflicts. The legal argument, in most cases, turns on intent. The burns don't. Contact with even a small fragment, a piece the size of a match head, produces a wound that cannot be treated by standard burn protocols. You cannot smother it. You cannot rinse it away. The standard field instruction is to keep the affected area submerged in water until surgical removal is possible, which is not a treatment so much as a pause. A substance that burns without a flame, that glows in the dark to tell you where it's hiding, and that the body cannot extinguish on its own. That's number 10. 9. Hydrofluoric acid. Pour a drop of hydrofluoric acid onto your skin and you will feel nothing. Not a sting. Not a tingle. Nothing at all. For several minutes, sometimes longer, depending on concentration. And that absence of sensation is precisely what makes this one of the most dangerous substances a person can encounter outside a controlled laboratory setting. Most acids announce themselves immediately. Contact with sulfuric acid or nitric acid produces an instant, unmistakable burn. Pain that tells you something is wrong and tells you fast. Hydrofluoric acid doesn't do that. It moves through the outer layers of skin quietly, without triggering the nerve response you'd expect. And by the time any discomfort registers, it has already passed through the dermis and entered the tissue beneath. What it does there is the part that separates this from ordinary chemical burns. Fluoride ions, the active component once the acid dissociates, bind aggressively to calcium and magnesium in the body. They seek it out. Bone is largely calcium phosphate, which makes it a target, and hydrofluoric acid at sufficient concentration will begin demineralizing bone before the surface wound shows any sign of severity. A burn that looks superficial on the skin can be destroying tissue and bone structure several layers down at the same time. The systemic effects are what make exposure potentially fatal from a surprisingly small surface area. Fluoride ions entering the bloodstream disrupt cardiac electrolyte balance. The heart runs on precise calcium signaling. Strip enough of that calcium away and the rhythm fails. There are documented cases of fatalities from hand and arm exposures covering less than 3% of total body surface area, a patch roughly the size of a large hand. That's not a number that sounds right until you understand the mechanism, and then it sounds exactly right. Standard rubber gloves, the kind used in most laboratory and industrial settings, offer somewhere between 2 and 4 minutes of protection against concentrated hydrofluoric acid before the material begins to degrade, not hours, minutes. The acid doesn't wait for a gap in the glove. It moves through the glove itself, given enough time and concentration. Treatment exists. Calcium gluconate gel applied topically delivers calcium ions directly to the exposure site and begins neutralizing the fluoride before it penetrates deeper. In severe cases, calcium gluconate is injected directly into affected tissue or administered intravenously to address systemic fluoride levels. But the treatment window is narrow in a way that matters enormously in practice. Because the initial exposure produces no pain, victims frequently don't realize they've been contaminated until significant absorption has already occurred. By the time the pain arrives, and it does arrive eventually, described consistently as deep, pressure-like, and severe, the fluoride has had time to work. The antidote exists. The problem is that the substance gives you no reason to reach for it until it may already be too late. Hydrofluoric acid has legitimate industrial applications: semiconductor manufacturing, glass etching, petroleum refining, the production of certain fluorine-based compounds. It is not exotic. It exists in functional quantities in facilities around the world, handled daily by trained personnel following strict protocols. Those protocols exist because the history of accidental exposure is well documented and consistently grim. A substance that causes no immediate pain on contact, crosses through standard protective equipment, targets calcium in bone and heart tissue simultaneously, and offers a treatment window that closes before most people know they need it. The question of what a dangerous chemical looks like, corrosive, fuming, visibly reactive, hydrofluoric acid answers that question by looking like water and behaving like none of those things until it's already inside you. At number 8, chlorine trifluoride. Chlorine trifluoride sets fire to sand. Not sand mixed with something flammable, just sand, on its own, on contact. It also ignites concrete, glass, and asbestos, which was for a long time considered a fireproofing material. The list of things chlorine trifluoride will not ignite is considerably shorter than the list of things it will. This is not a substance that requires a spark, or heat, or any external trigger. It is a halogen-interhalogen compound, a molecule built from chlorine and fluorine, and it is a more powerful oxidizer than oxygen itself. Most combustion requires oxygen because oxygen is what strips electrons from fuel and drives the reaction. Chlorine trifluoride does the same thing, faster, more aggressively, and with a lower activation threshold than almost anything else in chemistry. Materials that are entirely stable in air that would never spontaneously combust under normal conditions become fuel the moment chlorine trifluoride contacts them. In 1950, a storage tank failure at a chemical facility released roughly a ton of the substance. It burned through 30 centimeters of concrete flooring and a meter of gravel beneath it before the reaction was contained. A ton is about the weight of a small car. The hole it left behind was not a stain or a scorch mark. It was a physical absence in the floor. The combustion products are not an improvement. When chlorine trifluoride reacts with materials it's burning, it releases hydrogen fluoride gas, which is the gaseous form of the hydrofluoric acid we covered at number 9, along with other toxic fluorine compounds. So the fire itself is dangerous, and the smoke from the fire is separately dangerous, and the residue after the fire is dangerous. There is no phase of a chlorine trifluoride incident that is safe to be near. Containment is its own problem. Chlorine trifluoride reacts with water violently, which eliminates the most common fire suppression method. It reacts with most metals over time, which limits the materials you can use to store or transport it. The containers that do work, certain passivated metals like nickel and steel that have been pre-treated with a thin fluoride layer, work because chlorine trifluoride has already reacted with the surface and created a barrier against further reaction. The container survives by having already been partially attacked. And yeah, this substance does have industrial applications. It's used in the semiconductor industry for cleaning chemical vapor deposition chambers. Essentially, it's an aggressive cleaning agent that removes silicon deposits that nothing else can shift. It's also been investigated as a rocket propellant oxidizer, because its energy density and oxidizing power are genuinely useful in that context. The research on that application was largely discontinued, not because it didn't work, but because the engineering challenges of handling it at scale were assessed as unmanageable. The chemist J.D. Clark, writing in his History of Rocket Propellant Research, described chlorine trifluoride as a substance that can be considered as a sort of universal solvent, one that will react with nearly anything it touches, including, in his words, the researcher. He was not being hyperbolic. Exposure to the gas causes severe chemical burns to the respiratory tract, eyes, and skin simultaneously from the hydrogen fluoride it produces on contact with moisture. The body contains a great deal of moisture. Chlorine trifluoride is stored, transported, and used in controlled industrial settings by people who understand exactly what they're handling and have built extensive engineering controls around that understanding. The protocols exist because the alternative, treating it casually, has a documented and consistent outcome. A substance that burns what fire cannot, that poisons what it doesn't burn, and that has defeated most of the standard assumptions about what containment and suppression look like. It has been in industrial use for decades. The concrete in that 1950 facility was eventually repaired. The gravel beneath it was replaced. The substance itself hasn't changed at all. 7. Dimethylmercury. In 1997, Karen Vetterhahn was one of the leading organometallic chemists in the United States. She was a professor at Dartmouth College, an expert in metal toxicology, someone who understood chemical hazards at a level most people never approach. She was working with dimethylmercury as a calibration standard for NMR spectroscopy, a routine laboratory procedure, when a small quantity, less than half a milliliter, landed on the back of her latex glove. She was wearing the correct protective equipment. She followed standard laboratory protocol. She wiped it off. Dimethylmercury is a clear liquid, faintly sweet-smelling reportedly, though that detail is almost beside the point. It looks like water. It behaves like water in the sense that it flows, it evaporates, it doesn't announce itself with color or viscosity or any of the visual cues we associate with something that should not touch human skin. What it does that water does not do is cross latex in under 15 seconds, not degrade the glove, not seep through a gap, move through the intact material itself, because dimethylmercury molecules are small enough and non-polar enough to pass directly through the polymer structure of standard laboratory latex as though the glove weren't there. By the time Vetterhahn wiped the droplet away, absorption had already begun. The mercury in dimethylmercury is not the elemental mercury you'd find in an old thermometer, which is hazardous but relatively poorly absorbed through skin. Dimethylmercury is an organomercury compound. The mercury atom is bonded to two methyl groups, which makes it extraordinarily lipophilic. It dissolves into fatty tissue. It crosses the blood-brain barrier with almost no resistance, because the blood-brain barrier is largely lipid-based and dimethylmercury moves through lipids the way it moves through latex gloves, as if the barrier were a suggestion rather than an obstacle. Once inside the central nervous system, it begins destroying the cerebellum, the region responsible for coordination, balance, and fine motor control, along with other neural structures. The damage is not immediate. It accumulates over weeks and months, which is the cruelest part of the mechanism because there is a long window during which nothing seems wrong. Vetterhahn began experiencing symptoms roughly 5 months after the exposure: difficulty with balance and coordination, slurred speech, constricting vision. By the time she was admitted to hospital and the source of her condition was identified, the mercury concentration in her blood was 80 times the threshold considered life-threatening. 80 times. The treatment options at that level of neurological mercury poisoning are, functionally, none. You cannot remove mercury from neural tissue after it has bonded there. The damage the cerebellum had sustained was not reversible. She died in June of 1997, 10 months after the exposure. She was 48 years old. The case changed laboratory safety standards globally. Latex gloves are no longer considered adequate protection for work involving organomercury compounds. The recommended protection is laminated gloves, specifically silver shield or similar multi-layer laminate materials, which offer significantly better resistance to organomercury penetration. Some institutions now treat dimethylmercury as too dangerous to use for any purpose for which a safer substitute exists, which, for NMR calibration, it does. Dimethylmercury is still synthesized and still exists in research contexts. Its properties make it genuinely useful as a reference standard in certain spectroscopic applications, and there is no regulatory prohibition on its production or use, only updated handling guidelines. Those guidelines now specify that even laminated gloves should be considered a temporary barrier, not a guarantee. The substance that killed one of the country's foremost experts in metal toxicology, someone who knew exactly what she was handling, did so with less than half a milliliter through gloves she had every reason to believe were adequate, with a 5-month delay between contact and the first symptom. There is no smaller margin than that. 6. Ricin. Castor beans grow on a shrub called Ricinus communis that you can find in garden centers across Europe and North America. It's cultivated ornamentally for its large, dramatic leaves. The seeds, the beans, are processed commercially to produce castor oil, which is used in everything from lubricants to cosmetics to certain pharmaceutical formulations. It is an entirely ordinary plant with an entirely ordinary range of uses. The process of extracting castor oil from the beans produces a byproduct. That byproduct is ricin. Ricin is a protein, specifically a ribosome inactivating protein, and what it does at the cellular level is stop protein synthesis entirely. Every living cell in the human body depends on continuous protein synthesis to function, repairing damage, maintaining structure, producing enzymes, running the basic chemistry of staying alive. Ricin enters a cell, finds the ribosome, the cellular machinery responsible for building proteins, and permanently disables it. Not temporarily. The ribosome doesn't recover. The cell, deprived of its ability to produce proteins, dies. One ricin molecule can inactivate thousands of ribosomes, a single molecule. And because ricin is taken up by cells throughout the body rather than targeting a specific organ, the damage is systemic. Liver, kidneys, immune system, vascular tissue, all of it simultaneously degrading as cells lose the ability to maintain themselves. The estimated lethal dose for a human adult, delivered by injection or inhalation, is in the range of 1 to 10 micrograms per kilogram of body weight. For an average adult, that works out to somewhere between 70 and 700 micrograms total, a quantity that, at the upper end of that range, is roughly the weight of a few grains of table salt. At the lower end, it is invisible to the naked eye. There is no antidote. That's not a caveat or a qualification. It is simply the current state of medical knowledge. Treatment for ricin poisoning is supportive. Manage the symptoms, support organ function, keep the patient alive long enough for the body to clear the toxin if the dose was sublethal. If the dose was lethal, there is nothing to administer that reverses the cellular damage already done. Research into ricin antidotes and vaccines has been ongoing for decades, driven partly by biodefense interest, and candidates have been investigated in animal models. None has reached clinical approval for human use. If you're enjoying the video, drop a like and a comment. It really does help the channel out. And we're only halfway through. The substances coming up make ricin look like a starting point. Ricin has appeared in confirmed assassination attempts and plots. The most documented case is the murder of Georgy Markov, a Bulgarian dissident living in London in 1978. He was killed by a modified umbrella that fired a small pellet, roughly 1.5 millimeters in diameter, made of a platinum iridium alloy, into his leg while he waited at a bus stop. The pellet contained ricin. He died 3 days later. The mechanism of the weapon wasn't confirmed until the pellet was recovered during autopsy. The pellet itself held an estimated dose of around 500 micrograms, enough, delivered subcutaneously, to be fatal. The engineering required to produce both the delivery mechanism and the toxin was sophisticated, but the raw material, castor beans, was not. Ricin can be extracted from castor beans using processes that require no specialized equipment and no precursor chemicals that are themselves controlled. This is why it appears consistently in discussions of biological and chemical threat agents. The barrier to production is low, in a way that most comparably lethal substances are not. Ricin has also been investigated and, in limited historical contexts, actually developed as a potential weapon coating for bullets and other munitions, on the basis that a sublethal wound delivering even a small quantity could be made reliably fatal. Those programs did not advance to deployment, but the research established clearly that the toxin retains activity when delivered mechanically rather than ingested or inhaled. The castor plant is not going anywhere. Ricinus communis grows on every inhabited continent, produces seeds year-round in warm climates, and has no natural predator interested in eliminating it. The oil industry has no incentive to stop processing the beans. The byproduct will continue to exist as long as the industry does. A poison derived from a garden plant with no antidote, no minimum safe exposure, and a lethal dose measured in micrograms. The chemistry to produce it is documented. The plant that provides it is legal to own. The gap between those two facts is where the danger lives. Number 5. VX nerve agent. Every muscle in the human body receives a chemical signal to contract and a separate chemical signal to stop contracting. The signal to stop is delivered by an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, which breaks down the neurotransmitter acetylcholine after it has done its job. VX works by binding to acetylcholinesterase and disabling it permanently. The stop signal never arrives. Muscles fire continuously, including the diaphragm, including the heart, until they exhaust themselves and fail. This is not a metaphor for how VX behaves. This is the mechanism exactly at the molecular level. VX is an organophosphate compound developed in Britain in the early 1950s and subsequently shared with the United States as part of a defense research agreement. It is oily in consistency, not a gas at room temperature, which is a critical distinction from earlier nerve agents like sarin. That oiliness means it doesn't evaporate quickly. It persists. On a hard surface in moderate conditions, VX can remain active for days. On soil or porous material, longer. A contaminated area does become safe when the liquid dries. Because the liquid doesn't dry, it sits there, stable, waiting for contact. The substance absorbs through skin. Not through cuts or mucous membranes specifically, through intact, unbroken skin at any point of contact. The lethal skin dose is approximately 10 milligrams. That's the weight of roughly 2 to 3 drops of water, spread across the back of a hand. Invisible as a hazard, sufficient as a dose. Symptoms of VX exposure follow a predictable sequence that moves fast. Pinpoint pupils, excess salivation and tearing, muscle twitching that escalates to full convulsions, loss of bladder and bowel control, respiratory failure. The entire progression from first contact to incapacitation can occur within minutes at sufficient dose. At lower doses, the onset is slower, but the mechanism is the same. Acetylcholinesterase inhibition is cumulative, which means repeated sublethal exposures can add up to a lethal effect over time. Treatment exists and works if administered fast enough. Atropine blocks the effects of excess acetylcholine at the receptor level, buying time. Pralidoxim can reactivate acetylcholinesterase if given before the enzyme has been irreversibly bound, a process called aging, which in VX exposure occurs over a period of hours rather than the minutes it takes with some other nerve agents. That slightly longer window is one of the few characteristics of VX that works in a victim's favor. The other is that its persistence, while making it a more effective weapon, also makes it easier to detect in a contaminated environment. VX is classified as a weapon of mass destruction under the Chemical Weapons Convention and is banned from production, stockpiling, and use by the states that have signed it. Declared stockpiles have been destroyed under international supervision. The United States completed destruction of its VX stockpile in 2012. Russia declared and destroyed its stockpile under the same framework. In February of 2017, Kim Jong-nam, the half-brother of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, was killed at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. Two women approached him separately in a public terminal and each wiped a substance across his face. He died within 20 minutes of reaching the airport medical clinic. Analysis of samples taken from his body and from the women's clothing confirmed the presence of VX. Each woman had apparently been told she was participating in a prank for a reality television show and had handled only one component of a binary mixture. Neither alone was immediately dangerous, but combined on contact with his skin, they formed active VX. The airport terminal was not evacuated. Passengers continued moving through it for hours before the nature of the attack was confirmed. VX was used as an assassination weapon in a crowded international airport with a delivery method that required no specialized equipment, no protective gear for the perpetrators, and left the surrounding public unaware that a chemical weapon had just been deployed among them. That's what 10 milligrams looks like in practice. 4. The death cap mushroom and what it contains. Temperate forests across Europe, North America, and parts of Asia produce a mushroom called Amanita phalloides. It grows from late summer through autumn, often near oak and beech trees, emerging from the leaf litter as a pale greenish-capped fruiting body with white gills and a distinctive cup-like structure at the base of the stem called a volva. It looks, to an untrained eye, like several edible species. In parts of Europe, it resembles the paddy straw mushroom closely enough that foragers familiar with one but not the other have made fatal errors. In North America, it has been mistaken for puffballs when young and still enclosed in its veil. The toxins responsible for its lethality are a group of cyclic peptides called amatoxins, specifically alpha-amanitin and related compounds, and they are among the most stable biological toxins known. Boiling doesn't destroy them. Drying doesn't destroy them. Freezing doesn't destroy them. There is no preparation method that makes a death cap safe to eat, which eliminates the possibility of accidental safe consumption through cooking. The toxin that reaches your liver is chemically identical whether the mushroom was eaten raw, sautéed, or dried and stored for months. Alpha-amanitin targets RNA, polymerase II, the enzyme responsible for transcribing DNA into messenger RNA, which cells use to produce proteins. Disable RNA polymerase II, and you disable the cell's ability to read its own genetic instructions. Without those instructions, protein synthesis fails. Without protein synthesis, the cell dies. The liver is the primary site of damage because it processes ingested toxins, but kidney damage follows, and in severe cases, the impact extends to other organs. The timeline of amatoxin poisoning is what makes it so consistently lethal. Symptoms, nausea, vomiting, severe abdominal pain, appear somewhere between 6 and 24 hours after ingestion. This delay is itself dangerous because by the time the person feels ill, the toxin has already been absorbed and has been working on liver cells for hours. But then comes the part that has killed people who might otherwise have been saved. After the initial gastrointestinal phase, symptoms subside. The patient feels better, sometimes significantly better, well enough to resist hospitalization or to be discharged if they've already sought help. This apparent recovery lasts roughly a day. It is not recovery. The liver is continuing to fail beneath the surface, and when the second phase arrives, typically 2 to 4 days after ingestion, it arrives as acute liver failure, jaundice, coagulopathy, and in severe cases, hepatic encephalopathy. By this point, the window for effective intervention has often closed. Treatment options depend almost entirely on timing. Activated charcoal can reduce absorption if administered very early before significant uptake has occurred. Silibinin, derived from milk thistle, has shown some efficacy in reducing amatoxin uptake into liver cells and is used in European clinical settings. Aggressive supportive care can sustain patients through the toxic phase. But in cases of substantial ingestion where treatment is delayed past the first day, which happens regularly because the initial symptom-free window creates a false sense of resolution, liver transplant becomes the only remaining option that offers meaningful survival odds. Amanita phalloides is responsible for the majority of fatal mushroom poisonings worldwide. Estimates vary, but the proportion is consistently cited at somewhere around 90% of mushroom-related deaths globally. Not the majority. 90%. Every other toxic mushroom species combined accounts for the remaining fraction. The death cap has expanded its range. It's not native to North America or Australia. It arrived most likely in the root systems of imported European trees, particularly oaks and chestnuts planted for timber and ornamental purposes. It has now established itself across both continents and continues to spread as those tree populations expand. Foragers in regions where it didn't exist a generation ago are now encountering it without the cultural knowledge that would allow them to identify it correctly. A mushroom that looks ordinary, produces no immediate warning, offers a false recovery, and accounts for 9 in every 10 fatal mushroom poisonings on Earth. It has been doing this in forests across the northern hemisphere for as long as forests have been there. 3. Polonium-210. On the 1st of November, 2006, Alexander Litvinenko sat down at a table in the Pine Bar of the Millennium Hotel in Mayfair, London, and drank a cup of tea. He was a former officer of the Russian Federal Security Service who had defected to Britain and become a vocal critic of the Kremlin. He had been meeting with 2 other men. The meeting lasted less than an hour. Within days, he was in University College Hospital, his immune system collapsing, his hair falling out, his bone marrow failing. Doctors ran tests for thallium poisoning, for radiation exposure, for every toxic agent in the standard diagnostic framework. None of it matched. It took until the 23rd of November, 3 weeks after the tea, before a specialist team identified the substance. It was polonium-210. Litvinenko died that same day. He was 43 years old. Polonium-210 is a radioactive isotope that emits alpha particles. Alpha radiation is, in one sense, the weakest form of ionizing radiation. A sheet of paper stops it. Human skin stops it. Held in a sealed container, polonium-210 is essentially undetectable by standard Geiger counters because the alpha particles don't penetrate the container wall. This is why it passed through airport security undetected. This is why it sat in a hotel bar in a teapot without triggering any alarm. But alpha radiation inside the body is a different proposition entirely. Once ingested or inhaled, alpha particles travel through soft tissue at high energy, ionizing everything in their path. DNA strands, cell membranes, the molecular machinery of bone marrow, and the gastrointestinal tract. The same property that makes alpha radiation easy to shield externally makes it catastrophically damaging internally, because the energy that would have been stopped by a sheet of paper is instead deposited directly into living cells at close range. There is no distance. There is no barrier. The radiation source is inside the tissue it's destroying. The quantity used to poison Litvinenko was estimated at around 1 to 10 micrograms, a speck invisible to the naked eye, with no color, no taste, no smell. At that quantity, polonium-210 has an activity level measured in gigabecquerels, billions of radioactive decay events per second, each releasing an alpha particle into surrounding tissue. The dose he received was estimated to be many times the lethal threshold. There is no treatment for acute polonium-210 poisoning at lethal doses. Chelation therapy, used for heavy metal poisoning, has limited effect on polonium because it doesn't bind efficiently to the element. Supportive care can manage symptoms but cannot address the underlying source of damage, which is continuous and internal and self-sustaining until the polonium either decays or is cleared, a process measured in months given its half-life of around 138 days. The body cannot accelerate that timeline. The trail Litvinenko's killers left behind was itself a radiological contamination event. Polonium-210 leaves detectable traces wherever it travels, and investigators tracing the movements of the 2 suspects, Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun, found contamination across a remarkable geography: hotel rooms, aircraft seats, football stadium seats, a sushi restaurant, a nightclub. The contamination trail mapped their movements across London and back to Moscow with a specificity that conventional forensic evidence rarely achieves, because polonium-210 doesn't wipe away. It decays on its own schedule, indifferent to whether anyone is looking. British investigators identified the contamination on multiple British Airways aircraft that had operated the London-Moscow route during the relevant period. Passengers who had sat in affected seats were contacted and advised to seek medical assessment. None developed acute illness, but the public health response alone, the scale of tracing, testing, and notification required, illustrated what a microgram of polonium-210 loose in civilian infrastructure actually costs in terms of response. A British public inquiry concluded in 2016 that the operation to kill Litvinenko was probably approved by the director of the FSB and by Russian President Vladimir Putin. Russia has denied involvement. Polonium-210 is produced almost exclusively in nuclear reactors. The primary source is the Russian nuclear complex at Sarov. It is not a substance that can be synthesized in a laboratory or extracted from a natural source. Obtaining it requires access to nuclear infrastructure, which makes its appearance in a London hotel bar in a cup of tea, a statement about something beyond chemistry. The most effective poison in this story was invisible, tasteless, undetectable at the point of delivery, and left a trail across 2 countries that investigators are still documenting. That's what 1 microgram can do in the right hands. 2. Batrachotoxin, the poison that lives in a frog. Somewhere in the rainforests of Colombia, a small frog the size of a thumbnail sits on a leaf and is, gram for gram, one of the most chemically lethal things on Earth. The golden poison dart frog, Phyllobates terribilis, is bright yellow, which in the context of animal biology is not decoration. It is a warning. The color exists specifically to be seen, because the alternative, something touching the frog and finding out the hard way, is worse for everyone involved. The toxin it carries is batrachotoxin, not in its venom glands because it has none, in its skin, across its entire body surface in concentrations high enough that a single frog carries an estimated 1 milligram of batrachotoxin, enough, by toxicological estimates, to kill somewhere between 10 and 20 adult humans. 1 frog, 1 milligram, the weight of a small snowflake. Batrachotoxin is a steroidal alkaloid that targets sodium channels in nerve and muscle cell membranes. Sodium channels are the switches that control electrical signaling across cell membranes. They open to allow sodium ions in, generating the electrical impulse that tells a nerve to fire or a muscle to contract, then close again to reset. Batrachotoxin forces them open and holds them there. Permanently open, the channels flood the cell with sodium ions continuously. The electrical signal never resets, and the nerve or muscle cell becomes locked in a state of continuous activation until it fails. The heart is a muscle. The diaphragm is a muscle. Both are subject to the same mechanism. Death from batrachotoxin exposure occurs through cardiac arrhythmia and respiratory failure, typically within minutes at sufficient dose. There is no antidote in clinical use. Certain sodium channel blockers have shown some efficacy in animal studies. Tetrodotoxin, which is itself a potent toxin, has been investigated as a potential counteragent, but no treatment has been validated for human use. The research is complicated by the fact that batrachotoxin poisoning in humans is extraordinarily rare outside of the specific cultural context in which it has historically been used. The Embera people of Colombia have used Phyllobates terribilis for centuries to prepare blowgun darts. The preparation method involves rubbing the dart tip across the frog's back. The frog is not killed, not harmed beyond the stress of handling, and is released afterward. The toxin transferred to the dart tip in that brief contact is sufficient to incapacitate or kill prey, and historically, human adversaries. The name poison dart frog comes directly from this practice, though it applies to a whole family of frogs, Dendrobatidae, of which Phyllobates terribilis is the most toxic by a considerable margin. Most dendrobatid frogs are dangerous to handle. Phyllobates terribilis is in a separate category. Here's the detail that changes how you think about all of this. The frogs lose their toxicity in captivity. Completely. A golden poison dart frog raised in a laboratory or kept as a pet, which some people do legally in certain jurisdictions, produces no batrachotoxin at all. The toxin is not synthesized by the frog itself. It's accumulated from their diet in the wild, specifically from certain beetles in the family Meluridae that themselves contain batrachotoxin precursors, which the frogs metabolize and concentrate in their skin. Remove the dietary source and the toxicity disappears within a generation. This means the most acutely toxic vertebrate animal on Earth is only dangerous because of what it eats. The frog is, in a sense, a delivery mechanism for a toxin it didn't invent, a biological concentrator that takes trace quantities of poison from its food and accumulates them into something orders of magnitude more lethal than any individual component. The beetles, in turn, are thought to acquire their precursor compounds from plant sources, though the full dietary chain has not been completely mapped. The toxin originates somewhere in the forest floor ecology of Colombian rainforest, passes through insects, concentrates in a frog the size of a thumb, and ends up on the tip of a dart. Batrachotoxin is roughly 10 times more toxic than tetrodotoxin, the compound found in pufferfish, and somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times more toxic than VX nerve agent by equivalent mass. Not by mechanism, not by application, purely by the quantity required to produce a lethal effect, a quantity that, in the case of Phyllobates terribilis, is distributed across the skin of an animal you could cover with a playing card. The forest it lives in is shrinking. The frog is listed as endangered. The beetles it depends on are poorly studied. The full mechanism that produces one of the most lethal substances in nature is still not completely understood. And somewhere in what remains of that forest, on a leaf, a frog the color of a warning sign is sitting completely still, the most lethal substance ever characterized. Number 1. Botulinum toxin is a protein. It is produced by a bacterium called Clostridium botulinum that lives in soil, in sediment, in improperly preserved food, an organism so common it's essentially everywhere, producing, in the right anaerobic conditions, a molecule that holds a record no other substance on Earth has come close to breaking. The estimated lethal dose by injection is between 1 and 2 nanograms per kilogram of body weight. A nanogram is 1 billionth of a gram. For an average adult, the lethal injected dose sits somewhere around 90 to 130 nanograms total, a quantity so small it would be invisible on the tip of a needle, undetectable by smell, undetectable by taste, with no color and no physical property that would alert anyone to its presence. By inhalation, the threshold is higher but remains in the nanogram range. By ingestion, higher still, but still measured in micrograms, not milligrams. To put that in context, the lethal dose of VX nerve agent by skin contact is approximately 10 milligrams. 10 milligrams is 10 million nanograms. Botulinum toxin by injection is lethal at roughly 100 nanograms. That's not a marginal difference. That's a gap of 5 orders of magnitude. Botulinum toxin is around 100,000 times more potent than VX by equivalent delivery route comparison. Every other substance on this list, placed next to botulinum toxin on a lethality scale, shifts toward the safe end. The mechanism is specific and irreversible. Botulinum toxin is a protease, an enzyme that cuts proteins, and its target is a set of proteins called snares, which nerve terminals use to release neurotransmitters across the synaptic gap. At the neuromuscular junction, the relevant neurotransmitter is acetylcholine, the same one that VX prevents from being cleared. Botulinum toxin works from the opposite direction. It prevents acetylcholine from being released in the first place. The nerve signal arrives at the terminal. The vesicles containing acetylcholine are ready. The snare proteins that would fuse those vesicles to the membrane and release the neurotransmitter have been cleaved. Nothing crosses the gap. The muscle receives no signal and does not contract. Paralysis. Complete, descending, flaccid paralysis. Starting typically with the muscles of the face and throat. Drooping eyelids, difficulty swallowing, slurred speech. And progressing downward through the body as the toxin spreads through the nervous system. The diaphragm is a muscle. When botulinum toxin reaches the respiratory muscles, breathing stops. The patient remains conscious. The brain is unaffected because botulinum toxin does not cross the blood-brain barrier. Awareness is intact. Movement is not. Without mechanical ventilation, death follows from respiratory failure. With ventilation, an early diagnosis, and intensive supportive care sustained over weeks to months, survival is possible because the nerve terminals do eventually regenerate new snare proteins and restore function. That process takes months. Patients have required mechanical ventilation for over a year in severe cases, The total quantity of botulinum toxin required to kill every human being currently alive on Earth, all 8 billion people, has been estimated at a few kilograms. Not tons, not hundreds of kilograms. A few kilograms distributed effectively would be sufficient. That number has been calculated by researchers working on biodefense, and it is the number that placed botulinum toxin at the top of the CDCS list of Category A bioterrorism agents, the highest priority category reserved for agents considered to pose the greatest public health risk. And yet, the same molecule in doses calibrated at a scale billions of times smaller than the lethal threshold. Doses measured in units called mouse units, where 1 unit is the amount that kills 50% of a group of test mice, is injected into millions of people every year for medical and cosmetic purposes. Botulinum toxin type A, sold under brand names including Botox, is used to treat muscle spasticity, chronic migraine, hyperhidrosis, and cervical dystonia, among other conditions. The cosmetic application, temporary paralysis of facial muscles to reduce the appearance of wrinkles, is the most widely known use and accounts for tens of millions of procedures annually worldwide. The dose used in a standard cosmetic procedure is somewhere around 20 to 40 units. The estimated lethal intravenous dose for a human adult is in the range of 2,000 to 3,000 units. The margin between therapeutic and lethal is real, but it is not infinite, and it is maintained entirely by precision of dosage and delivery site. Clostridium botulinum is in the soil outside, right now. It is in garden compost, in lake sediment, in the intestinal tracts of many animals. The conditions that allow it to produce toxin, anaerobic, low acid, moderate temperature, sufficient nutrient availability, are the conditions inside an improperly sealed jar of home-preserved vegetables, which is why botulism outbreaks from home canning continue to occur every year in countries across the world, including the United States and across Europe. The most acutely lethal substance ever characterized by science is not locked in a military facility. It is not the product of a classified program. It is made by a bacterium that lives in dirt, and it has been doing so for longer than our species has existed. There is no smaller unit of danger than this. The list ends here, at the edge of what a single molecule can do to a living thing. If you thought these were some of the most dangerous substances on the planet, wait till you see our video on the world's deadliest animals. Click here and I'll see you over there.